This is the second session of our year-long look at responding to student data. In the first session, we looked at narrowing our focus, and today we're going to look at how we can get useful information from the school report card. This specifically addresses PS 4 and 8 in your Past 2 notebook. And in this video, we're going to start by looking at the driving forces of data analysis, a bit of a closer look at why we do data analysis, what the end goal is from it. Then we're going to take a look at the actual school report card, and I'm going to model some analysis for you. We're going to talk about how to then turn that analysis into good questions so that we can tell a story about the data. And then I'll review what you need to bring with you to the next session that we're going to do in October. There are really two driving forces behind data analysis that we do when we're talking about student achievement. And the first is we want to answer the question of who is succeeding. Don't focus so much on who is not succeeding. Don't focus so much on where the gaps are. Those reveal themselves when we do this analysis. What we first want to look at is what is actually working. Who are the students who are succeeding? And then once we know who is succeeding and specifically what they're succeeding at, we can ask ourselves, why are they succeeding? What are the factors behind their success that are building them up? Is it something in them? Is it something in us as teachers? Is it something in the curriculum? We need to examine those two things. This is the ultimate two goals behind student achievement data analysis. Once we've told the story of this data, this really does feed into some conversations that are all student-centered conversations. And there's a slight change that you might notice when we're talking about student-centered conversations. So, for example, instead of talking with our colleagues, our collaboration team, about how are our students doing, we might turn the focus around and say, how are the students doing? That's a small change in the focus, but it really is an important change when we're thinking about student-centered learning, student-centered teaching, student-centered conversations. We can also ask, why do we think our students performed the way they did? The focus isn't on us. The focus isn't on outside circumstances. The focus is really on the students and how the students are doing. We would also ask, what are we going to do about intervention for our students who are still not proficient? The focus isn't really on what we are going to do for the students. The focus is on the students. What are we going to do for them? Let's make it a little more individualized. Let's take a look at the patterns that we see in our classes. That means it's going to be different every time. In fact, it might be different from period to period, but that's where our focus really needs to be. How can we accelerate instruction for the students who continue to excel? Not what can we do to accelerate instruction, period, but what can we do for these specific students? We would also ask which instructional strategies would produce the greatest results for students. Not what can we do, what are we going to do, not focusing on us as teachers, but focusing on helping those individual students. Now, we've all seen this instructional cycle before. This won't be a surprise to anybody, but we do want to make sure that we are looking at making specifically student-focused instructional choices. So we always start by looking at what the standards are for our course. And these are given to us by the state, or if we don't have state standards, we have national standards or outcomes that are determined by somebody outside of ourselves or our own. But we already know what our standards are. We've all been through the unit planning. And then we look at turning those standards into KUDs. And we've spent plenty of time on that. What will students know? What will students understand? And what will students be able to do? And kind of unpacking the standards to make those specific statements. Once we have those, then we go into the actual instructional planning. How do we get students to learn those things? And this is where you really excel as teachers in this process. This is what they spend most of the time doing when we're in college, learning these processes. How do we get the information across to students in ways that are relevant and useful and meaningful to them? And then, of course, we can't skip the assessment step. And this is kind of where we spent a lot of last year, was looking at the different types of assessment and how we can work those in. And then, of course, we have to say, okay, well, now that we've done the assessment, we have to actually analyze the assessment. What have students learned? And then once we've done that, we can go back and compare what they've learned to the standards. Did they meet the standards? Have they mastered these? Have they achieved mastery? And this year, we're going to focus specifically on the students have learned step. We want to make sure that we really understand where students are, what they've learned, and if they've mastered things, and how to tell all of those things. If they haven't, what do we do? If they have, what can we do? Just to review from last time, there are three kind of questions that we need to ask if we want to narrow down our focus for data analysis. The first of those is we want to ask ourselves, is this data useful or very useful to you in your situation? Right? Is this something that you would use in your class or your classes in your context right now? There's a lot of data out there that we made lists of that you can just ignore, things that don't apply to you at all, that are probably useful to somebody somewhere, because otherwise why would they have recorded it if it wasn't useful to them? But if it's not useful to you, you are empowered to ignore that data. Set it aside, don't worry about it. There's nothing that you're going to get useful out of it. Don't worry about that stuff. The second question is whether you have any influence over the outcome of that data. For example, socioeconomic status is not something that you have much control over for a student's family. Probably you have no control over that for a student's family. But there are some things, some factors that you might be able to influence in school. If that's the case, you can try coming at it from a different angle. The same thing happens if a student is working multiple jobs and doesn't have time for homework. Well, you can't control the fact that they're working multiple jobs, but there might be other things that you can influence. So complaining that a student is working multiple jobs doesn't help you at all, but looking at other factors might. So focus on the factors that you have influence over and ignore the ones you don't. And finally, we want to make sure that any changes we make are high impact changes, not just urgent changes. We don't want to add to what we're doing. We want to take away a low impact choice and replace it with a high impact choice. Now, you've heard this before when we talk about instructional choices. Lecturing is a very low impact choice. All the studies show that lecturing has one of the lowest results of understanding of any of the ways that we can teach. It's not a bad way to teach, it's just a low impact way to teach. And if we're going to put in higher impact things, we don't want to lecture and do something else. We want to take away the low impact and add back high impact. Same thing with data collection. Are you giving tests or assessments or collecting data that is very high impact data that gives you a lot of good information that you can look at? Or are you just getting low impact data that gives you one bit of information about one very small thing? That's not what we want. We want to make sure we're doing high impact data and getting a lot of information for as little assessment as possible. Once you've asked yourself those questions and you've narrowed down kind of the focus of your data, you can start moving on to the actual analysis. Let's move on to the next step. Now that we've looked at the driving forces of data analysis, and we can actually take a look at the school report card itself. The school report card is published by the state every year, mostly based on data that we have sent in or that they have gotten from standardized test results that the students have taken. We spend a lot of time as an admin team collecting this information, compiling it, and sending it in to them. So a lot of this is based on what we've sent in. Now, what I have here is actually last year's school report card. You can see that it is last year's. It's got the 2014 up here in the corner. The 2015 report card hasn't been published yet. It will be published the next month or so, and that will be sent to you as soon as that is published. There are two versions of this. There is the summary, which is displayed on the screen here, and then there is a full version, which is somewhere around 11 pages long. We're going to take a look kind of at both and pull information from both of them, but for right now, we're just going to kind of look at the summary. We're going to work through these. If you want to look at your own or check out for other schools, you can go to the state website, ed.sc.gov, and look under the data section. The first section is the performance section. This is right at the very top of the first page. And this is where it gives us our rankings, our ratings, and the awards that we've gotten in our ESA grade for each year. And you can see that in 2014, our absolute rating was excellent. Our growth rating was excellent. They haven't announced the gold and silver awards by the time this was published. And our ESA grade was a B, in the B range. I think it was 88 this last year. And Ms. Calloway goes over all this at the beginning of your meeting, but here's where this information is for Blue Ridge, and you can get this from any other school through the state's website. Now it also talks about the absolute ratings of high schools with students like ours, right down here. And it's got a little star there to tell you what that means. What that means is schools with similar demographics. So about the same number of students and about the same poverty rate. And you can see that in South Carolina, there are 16 other schools that have similar demographics to ours, about 1,200 students, and a similar poverty rate. And among those 16 schools, 14 of them ranked excellent and 2 of them ranked good, which means that we are in very good company and probably have a little bit of competition here. The next section talks about the HSAP, the High School Assessment Program passage rate. Now, the state has done away with this. We don't do this anymore, but when this report was done, we did give the HSAP in the 2014 school year, so it is included in the school report card. And you can see it breaks it down to our high school in these columns, and then high school students like ours in these columns. So in 2014, the percent of students who passed both was around 85%, schools like ours, 83.7%. And you can see that from 2013 to 2014, that number went from 87.6 down to 85. Schools like ours went from 85.5 down to 83.7. The next line here is those who passed one or the other of the 2 tests, either the math or the English, but not both. And then here those who didn't pass either test when they took it. Now this number looks very large, 4.6%, but remember by this point, students knew that this wasn't going to be a graduation requirement, so there wasn't nearly as much pressure to do well on that, and a lot of students just didn't take it very seriously. If the HSAP passage rate by spring 2014, this is overall, students who've taken it multiple times and ended up passing it. And you can see what our high school passage rate was, and that for schools with students like ours. And you can look at these numbers and do a little bit of comparison. The next section talks about the on-time graduation rate, and that's exactly what it sounds like. Students who graduated within 4 years of starting high school. And again, it compares schools with students like ours to us, and you can take a look at those numbers and see how we're doing. Then we get to the EOC results for 2014. These show what the state recorded from their looking at the tests. For some reason, these numbers almost never match up exactly to what we record because some students, they decide count and some students don't count. And so the percentages that we report to you when you see your passage rates don't necessarily match up exactly with these. But these are the official state recorded results here. So you can see that for Algebra 1, we had officially a 77.7% passage rate, whereas schools with students like ours had an 85.6% passage rate. You can look at English 1 and compare our 73.9 with their 76.1. For biology, our 86.1 compared to the rest of the schools' 86.8. US history, you can compare those numbers. You can see that of all of these, for both us and for schools like ours, US history is by far the lowest scoring one. That says something about the test, not about the students. And then the overall passage rate for the EOCs. If we take a look at the school profile, according to the state, this is all the official numbers. They list out several things here that might be interesting and might not be interesting, and some of the things you might have some effect in your classroom and some you might not. Retention rate is how many students get retained or don't promote from one grade to the other in a given year. Attendance rate is the number of days students were present in school. Numbers served by gifted and talented program, those with disabilities, older than usual for grade, which means they may have been held back in previous years. Out of school suspension or expulsion for violent or criminal offenses, enrolled in AP programs, successful in AP, that means they passed AP tests, eligible for life scholarship, career technology students, that's ones who go to bonds or other similar career centers, enrollment in those, the number, not instead of the percent, and then attaining technical skills means they were successful in those programs, actually got their certifications they were going for, and then the annual dropout rate, which is different from the graduation rate. So if we take a look at some of these and compare our numbers from our school compared to schools like ours, we look for big differences between these numbers. One that's a big difference is here. That stands out to me. Success on AP stands out to me. Eligible for Life Scholarship stands out to me. And pretty much the rest of these are in line. You can also look at the changes up and down. The one that really stands out is enrolled in an AP program. What's this tell me that in 2014 we had almost 31% enrolled, but the previous year we had 50%? That doesn't sound right to me. I don't think we had half of our student population enrolled in an AP program the previous year. So something looks wrong with this number to me. But as we look at these numbers, we start looking for patterns. Do we see things improving? And sometimes up is improving, sometimes down is improving. Are we consistently improving? Are we consistently getting worse? And how are we compared with students like ours or with the state? You can see that in this case, schools like ours, the state, are pretty equal. Here there's a little bit of a difference, but they're much closer than we are. And here they're pretty equal. So what does that mean? What does that tell us? What can we get from that information? So now that you've had a brief introduction to the school report card, we're going to go on and take a look at what we do once we've taken a look at some of those and notice some patterns, point out some things that you've seen. The point of data analysis is to ask good questions. We're always looking for data to generate questions so that we can go back and find more questions. Those of you in the humanities are used to this. You just call it something else. In English, it's called close reading. You read a text, you ask questions about it, and you go back to the text to look for those more detailed answers. In history and social studies, you look at primary documents, you ask some questions, and then you go back to the primary documents or search for secondary documents to find the answers to those questions. Same thing happens in doing data analysis. We're not going to do any fancy statistics. We're not going to do any regressions to the mean or any of those things that you had to learn in that statistics for education course you took. We're just looking for things to ask questions about so we can go back and find some better answers that are useful to us. So remember, our two overarching questions are who is succeeding and why are they succeeding? And so the first thing you might want to ask is, well, what's the definition of success? What does it mean to be succeeding on the EOC or the AP or graduation rate or any of those other things? Asking definition questions is always a good place to start. Then you can also start looking for some patterns. And you might look for noteworthy patterns, things that stand out to you, or problematic patterns, things that just look really bad. Like when you saw that our rate of suspensions and expulsions for violent and criminal behavior was 4 times the state average. That's a pattern that you might want to ask a question about. It's a troublesome, problematic pattern. You also want to prioritize the patterns. Is that an important pattern to you? And go back to those 3 questions I asked before. Is this something that is important to you in your context? Is it something you have any influence over? And is it something that is a high impact? Look for patterns over time. The school report card gives you the last year, sometimes last 2 years of data. Is it always a problem, or does it just take a 1-year dip? And then also look at the subgroups. Is it consistently a problem for one subgroup over another? You want to make sure that your questions are very specific questions, not too broad. You want to be able to focus in on things, and that they are measurable, that you have some way of measuring the outcome so you know when you found the answer. It's always good to give some examples, so let's take a look at examples of good questions. If your pattern, you notice that there was low student performance on exam application problems, so problems that require students to apply, so up that level of Bloom's taxonomy, and that these problems persist for year after year despite instructional strategy changes. Well, it's tempting to ask, how can I improve my teaching to get students better at this? But the focus shouldn't be on you. The focus should be on the students and what is useful in your context. So instead of that, try asking something like, what factors are leading to students' poor problem-solving skills? Now, it might be that they're missing some key information from previous classes. It might be something else. It might be you. It might be that you're not good with application problems. But don't assume it's you. That first question, how can I improve my teaching, assumes that you are the problem. You don't have to assume that you're the problem. Find out all of the factors that could be leading to those, and then you can start investigating them. Maybe there's concerns raised by other faculty members that students' writing skills are just poor across the board. And despite lots of theories being put out there and lots of teachers saying, oh, I think it's this, let's try that, I think it's this, let's try that, If after you've addressed all those theories, it's still not working, don't ask, why are students' writing skills uneven? That's a very broad question. That's not specific and focused and narrow enough, and it's not really a measurable thing. You should instead ask something like, what factors contribute to students' writing skills in their literature courses? Once you've narrowed down what those factors can be, you can start looking at what factors are actually influencing the student success or lack of success. If there's, for example, concerns about enrollment in STEM classes, and that's science, technology, engineering, and math classes, and there's poor performance in the gateway courses. Now in the science department, this would be like biology and chemistry, and then concern about enrollment in the higher level classes. Instead of asking, why does our school seem so ineffective at encouraging and supporting students, try asking, what are the trends in STEM attainment and enrollment? And how do those trends here compare to trends in other schools that are like ours? Because if you can see trends that exist in other places, well, now you have another research point to go to find out how other people are addressing them. Is it something that, if it's a statewide problem, is it really something you can influence, is under your control, or do you need to shift your focus to something else? All right, we've talked about asking good questions. Let's look at how to tell a good story. Data ultimately should reveal things. It should reveal questions and it should reveal answers. And once something has been revealed, there's a story to be told. So again, once you've done this analysis, once you've looked at the patterns, once you've asked some questions, you've written some questions down, there is a story to be told about who is succeeding and why they're succeeding. Throwing numbers up on a screen doesn't do people much good unless you can tell a story with those numbers. Tell about the people who are succeeding. Tell about the ones who are succeeding really well and what factors are contributing to that. Why are they succeeding and how can that be replicated, adapted, and given to all the other classes? Let's take a quick look at the bringbacks for our next face-to-face session. Remember that you need to come with your 2 to 4 data sources that you're going to commit to using that are very useful in your context. No more than 4, please. You're going to get overwhelmed if you do that, and at least 2, so you have things to compare with each other. There's an online discussion that's part of this, and this is kind of my compliance check, and to continue the conversation. You're going to go to schoology.com, and on the screen here is the access code. It will also be in the CRT newsletter and email that you get, where you can sign up for an account and use that code to join the class. Then you click on discussions, and there is a discussion question for you to complete. All the materials you need are at my website. The website is on the page here. There will also be a link sent to you by email and in the CRT newsletter. So you get the materials, you'll follow the directions at schoology.com using that class code, and then make sure you've completed it by the deadline that's on the website, and we will have a much shorter face-to-face session in October.